Now that you understand how to prepare a flexible budget and how we can estimate the revenue and expenses based on the amount of production that actually takes place in our organization, let's take a look at how we use the standard cost system to evaluate the differences between those budgeted costs that we use in the flexible budget compared to what we have actually spent in the production process. And so not all companies, okay, but several companies will use a standard costing system to do a comparison of actual to budgeted amounts to find their inefficiencies. Other organizations, for example, on a tour of Gerdau Steel a couple of years ago with our Principles of Accounting class, the accountants revealed to us that they were doing away with their standard costing system because their process is an ongoing process. They manufacture primarily 3 different products and the process never stops. And so as far as they were concerned, we're moving actual costs through when the actual costs happen, and we're not going to stop and make adjustments every month or every quarter for our variances. We will adjust them at the end of the process. And so for this organization, standard costing just wasn't something that was beneficial to their organizations. But it is very beneficial to others that do not have such a continuous process, and they do need to evaluate and benchmark whether they are meeting their strategic objectives for their organization or not. And so the standard is simply what we estimate the cost of our materials or labor to be and the quantity of the material that we think we'll purchase or the hours that we will use under normal conditions. So in your book under cheerful colors, what is the normal amount of paraffin that's required for the crayons, and what are the normal hours to manufacture a batch? And so we estimate the standards based on those normal conditions, and then we will keep up with we will actually move costs through production using our standards and then compare them to actual at the end of the month or quarter or whatever time period the company sees efficient for them. All right, so how do we set standards? We look at 2 different types of standards. Let me pull my pen here. First, we're going to look at cost standards. Okay, and those cost standards, so we're looking at who's responsible for that. Well, if we think about direct materials, the person responsible for what raw materials cost us is typically the purchasing manager. He or she is the person who is setting up a contract with a particular vendor for the material cost. If there are any discounts, are there any delivery requirements? Do we have credit policies or potential interest related to those purchases? So this is the purchasing manager. When we look at direct labor, this is primarily human resources, because what is the cost of direct labor? It's what we pay per hour. So what's our hourly rate? How do we determine what we pay people? What are their related payroll taxes and fringe benefits? So when we think about the cost of direct labor, it's not just your hourly rate. So if I have to pay your Social Security, if I have to pay your disability or part of your insurance, or I contribute to your retirement account, all of those things are part of the cost of labor. So manufacturing overhead. So this, remember, is all of those things, all of those costs related to production that aren't easily traceable: indirect material, indirect labor, depreciation, maintenance. And so this usually comes from the production manager estimating what are all of those expenses tied up into the production process that are not direct labor or direct material. So if we're trying to identify why we're spending more or less because of cost, this is where we would go to analyze. Now, the second standard is called the efficiency standard. And in the efficiency standard for direct materials, we want to know, well, who decides how much material, how much paraffin I'm going to need per crayon. And we probably have an engineer who has set up a product spec for us, an engineering spec design that tells us the amount of material, the amount of labor that needs to go into a part. And so efficiency is simply determining how much material do I need? Will it spoil? Will it run on the particular machines that we have? Okay, so when we're talking about efficiency for direct labor, we want to know how well did our people perform in the manufacturing process. And so the production manager and engineer, once again, is going to be responsible for letting us know this is the amount of estimated time that we think this product is going to take. All right, so we need to break the standards down into cost and efficiency, because how we evaluate a variance in a cost standard and a variance in an efficiency standard are two different things. All right, so how do we determine what those cost standards are going to be? Once again, we have usually a product design engineer who tells us the amount of materials and the amount of labor that they think we're going to need in a product, and we're going to go back to our purchasing agent and say, okay, what's the purchase price? What are we paying for this material? Are there any other expenses related to delivery, getting it into our manufacturing facility? Does it have to go through some kind of inspection? So this is simply estimating what is the total cost of materials, okay, and here it happens to be per pound. It could be per ounce or per ton, depending on what you're manufacturing. The direct labor standard, simply we're going to estimate, well, what is the hourly wage for the people working on this product, and what are their benefits, and we bring that down to a cost per direct labor hour. Now, with our variable and fixed overhead, to go back and think about, remember this overhead, these are costs tied to the manufacturing process that can't be directly traced to it. And so once again, indirect material, indirect labor, depreciation, maintenance, supervisor salaries, we need to break them down into variable and fixed. Variable, we can see if there are some inefficiencies going on. Fixed, basically, variances will happen because of volume. Right? And so we're estimating the total amount of overhead, and we're estimating what's driving overhead. In this case, we've estimated that direct labor hours. For every hour that my direct labor people work, they cost me X amount of variable overhead or X amount of fixed overhead. And what we've determined is for variable overhead, for every hour, direct labor hour that my people work, they cost me $3 in overhead. Variable overhead. For every hour that my direct labor people work, they cost me $2 in fixed overhead. So we estimate these standards for material, labor, and variance, and then we are going to look at our second side, which is efficiency. Okay, once again, the product manager and engineers are going to help us decide how much direct materials we need, how much direct labor we need, and if I use more or less materials than I thought, that's an efficiency issue. If I spend more for the materials than I thought, that's a cost issue. Okay, so once again, we've kind of talked about how these things are established, and we're estimating these based on normal practices or on best practices. Okay, in the best set of circumstances, how much material would we use? In the best set of circumstances, how much labor would we use? And so generating these standard costs give us the numbers that we need to prepare our master budget, because now I have an estimated cost for materials per unit. I have an estimated cost for labor per hour, and I can use those numbers to estimate the cost of production in the master budget and in the flexible budget. It can help me to identify performance standards. Are we using more or less labor, more or less material than we thought? It helps me to determine my sales prices, because if I know the cost of my product and I know the return that I want to generate on that product, then I can determine what an appropriate sales price would be. And if we incorporate the standard costing process appropriately into our accounting information system, then it can actually generate more efficient accounting cost, less accounting cost. So if we can look at this in a pictorial summary of what we've talked about here. Remember, we've got the cost variance. Okay, so what is generating the cost variance? We're simply looking at, did I spend more or less than what I thought I was going to spend? Cost. And so when I have determined if there is a difference, and there will be, because these are just estimates, if I have spent more than I thought I should have, I'm going to have an unfavorable variance. We multiply that unfavorable variance times the actual quantity of materials that we purchase, and I have a cost variance. I'm trying to come up with the dollar amount that is my difference. Okay, now, so this is our cost variance. If we come over and we take a look at our efficiency variance, now we're looking at what is the difference between the actual quantity that I used and the standard quantity that I thought I was going to use. We multiply that times the standard cost and we have the efficiency variance. So together, these two variances make up our total product cost variance. And once again, how I address spending more than I thought on material or labor is different than how I would address using more or less materials or using more or less direct labor hours. So this helps us to give a manager information they need to make the processes more efficient. Now let me back up here and say, once again, some of you may become accountants, some of you will not. If you are the accountant, you may be putting this information together. But if you are a business manager, you need to know how to interpret, analyze, and make decisions off of this information. So you want to be sure that the information is relevant, and understanding how it is prepared helps you to understand that relevance. Okay, so our cost variance, as I said, measures how well we keep the cost of our material and labor within the standards that we have set up. When we find the difference, we multiply it times the actual quantity. So here's the written formula for what you saw on the prior page. So my cost variance simply is the difference between my actual cost and my standard cost times the actual quantity. Okay. The efficiency variance, on the other hand, is not about the cost of my product or labor. It is about the amount. Okay, and if we'll look on the efficiency side, we're looking at what was the actual quantity, whether it's material or direct labor hours, compared to what I thought I should have used in material or labor, and we multiply that times the standard cost to come up with our efficiency variance. So we can see this illustration one more time pictorially here. Remember, we have our actual results. Let's say that these actual results are from manufacturing 55,000 smart tablets. But what if my budget said, my static budget was based on 50,000? Then we've got this big difference between actual for 55 and static for 50. So we've got this large static budget variance, and we need to know what that is. But part of this static budget variance was just a result of sales volume. And so if I have manufactured and sold 55,000 units instead of the 50,000 units that I had budgeted in my static budget, then obviously, okay, what I should have actually spent for 55 and what I actually did spend for 55 and what I thought I should spend on 50 is going to be significantly different. Okay, so this is important, but this is not enough information to make wise decisions. What I want to know is, what should the flexible budget have been for 55,000 units if I actually produced 55,000 units? So I'm preparing a budget for what I actually produced. Is it after the fact? Yes. But I know that the actual results for 55,000 units should be different than this budget for 50. So this gives me, in the flexible budgeting, this is the part of the budget variances that I can use to make decisions. The cost, as we talked about, why did I spend more or less on material, on the cost of my materials or my direct labor hours than I had intended? This is about quantity. Buying more or less materials than I needed, using more or less direct labor hours than we thought. So I hope you can see how this will help you identify the part of the budget that a manager can use to make good decisions about their company to help make them more efficient. Take a break, make some notes. We'll come back and look at how we can, some actual calculations of those direct material and direct labor variances.